Elena Torres had always dreamed of serving her country. From the moment she could remember, she had idolized the uniform, the discipline, and the sense of purpose it brought. Her family had not been wealthy, and growing up in a small town had taught her resilience and determination. When she received her acceptance into the military, she felt a surge of pride mixed with a quiet apprehension. She knew this path would test her in ways school or small-town life never had, but she was ready, or so she thought. Arriving at the base for the first time, Elena felt the weight of her decision settle heavily on her shoulders. The sprawling compound was a mix of sterile metal buildings, long stretches of concrete, and manicured lawns, all surrounded by fences and barbed wire. Soldiers moved in precise formations across the grounds, their boots striking the earth in perfect rhythm. The sound was hypnotic, like a heartbeat for the entire base. She swallowed nervously, clutching her duffel bag as she stepped from the transport bus. Her uniform was freshly pressed, boots polished, her hair neatly tucked under her cap. She wanted to look perfect. She wanted to make a good first impression. From the very beginning, Elena noticed the subtle hierarchy and tension that permeated the base. She was a newcomer, a female soldier in a world that still leaned heavily toward men. Some of the older soldiers glanced at her with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled doubt. It was subtle at first, an eye roll here, a whispered comment there, but she sensed that respect would not be given freely. It would have to be earned. Her first day of training was a blur of activity. Drill instructors barked orders in harsh tones, their commands echoing off the metal buildings. Elena's muscles screamed with unfamiliar effort. Her lungs burned with every sprint across the parade ground. Yet she pushed forward. Each push-up, each lap, each repetition of drills was a declaration. She belonged. She might be new, she might be underestimated, but she would not be broken. Despite her determination, Elena quickly realized that some obstacles were not about stamina or skill. The base was rife with unspoken rules, and navigating them required careful observation. Certain soldiers dominated communal spaces with subtle authority, while others used quiet manipulation to maintain control over those beneath them. Elena watched carefully, taking mental notes, learning who to trust and who to avoid. There were whispers about the Colonel Briggs, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. He was known for his sharp temper, sudden outbursts, and the power he wielded without question. To some, he was a brilliant leader. To others, a tyrant. Elena did not yet know which he was, though the tension she felt when she walked near his office suggested it was something more dangerous than either description. Meals in the mess hall were an exercise in social navigation. She sat quietly at first, scanning the room, noting the cliques and the unspoken hierarchy of seating arrangements. Some soldiers were friendly, offering small nods and polite conversation, but many kept their distance. She understood the unspoken message. Trust was earned, not given. Elena chose her words carefully, laughing softly when appropriate, keeping her head down when tensions rose. She had learned early on that silence could be a shield, but courage would eventually be her weapon. Evenings were the hardest. Elena's quarters were small and bare, a simple cot, a desk, and a locker providing little comfort. Alone, she replayed the day in her mind. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered comment was scrutinized. Was she doing enough? Was she earning respect? Was she invisible, or was invisibility a protection in a place where standing out could be dangerous? She reminded herself of why she was there. Not to be invisible, not to fit in, but to excel, to honor the uniform she had worked so hard to earn. Her first encounter with Colonel Briggs, though indirect, left a mark. She had been called to the administrative office to submit routine paperwork. The colonel entered with the kind of presence that demanded immediate attention. The room seemed to shrink as his gaze swept across it. Elena's heart raced, but she remained standing, shoulders squared. He did not speak at first. He merely studied the paper she handed over, then looked up, fixing her with a steady stare. There was no warmth in his expression, only a piercing intensity that seemed to see far beyond the surface. She felt both intimidated and strangely alert, as if a challenge had been silently issued. Over the following days, Elena observed him more closely. Colonel Briggs was a man of extremes. He could be meticulous and precise, commanding respect when he praised a job well done. But that praise was rare. His anger was sudden, explosive, and often disproportionate. Soldiers who had misstepped even slightly had been publicly humiliated, their errors recounted in ways that left them fearful and submissive. Elena realized that survival in this environment required not just skill and courage, but careful navigation of egos and authority. Every action had consequences, and one wrong move could be disastrous. Despite the fear that lingered in the background, Elena's determination only grew. She reminded herself of her purpose, of the sacrifices that had led her here. Each morning, she laced her boots tightly and stepped onto the grounds with renewed focus. She trained harder, studied longer, and observed more keenly than anyone else. Slowly, a reputation began to form not yet among the upper ranks, but among her peers. They began to notice her quiet confidence, the way she moved with precision, the way she refused to be intimidated. Elena had yet to face the greatest test, but even now, she was laying the foundation for something extraordinary. She also discovered unexpected allies. A few older soldiers, who had been quietly watching her, began offering subtle guidance tips on avoiding mistakes, warnings about the colonel's moods, advice on handling difficult situations. Their support was invaluable. Elena realized that courage alone was not enough. Strategy, alliances, and intelligence were equally important. She listened, learned, and adapted, weaving together the skills and wisdom she would need to survive and eventually thrive. By the end of her first week, Elena had earned small victories. A drill completed flawlessly, a respectful nod from a senior officer, a subtle recognition from a peer. These victories were small, almost imperceptible, but they mattered immensely. They reinforced her belief that she could belong, that she could command respect without compromising her integrity. Yet beneath these successes, an undercurrent of tension persisted. She had not yet met the colonel directly in a confrontational setting. That encounter, she sensed, would define much of what lay ahead. Late at night, in the quiet of her quarters, Elena would sometimes sit at her desk and write. She documented her experiences, her observations, and her feelings. She wrote about her fears, her hopes, and the challenges she faced. These pages became a private testament to her resolve, a way to process the complexity of life on the base. They reminded her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. She had entered this world ready to prove herself, and she would not allow anyone, no matter their rank or reputation, to diminish her resolve. Elena Torres, the quiet soldier, had stepped into the military not just to serve, but to survive, to grow, and to leave her mark. She understood that her journey would be fraught with challenges, both visible and invisible, and that every day would demand her courage, intelligence, and strength. What she did not yet know was that the most harrowing test of her resolve was just around the corner. A moment that would challenge her dignity, her courage, and her very identity would soon arrive. And when it did, the quiet soldier would be forced to make a choice, one that could change everything on the base forever. Colonel Briggs was a presence that dominated the base long before he physically appeared. Soldiers would stiffen mid-step at the faint sound of his boots against the concrete, a rhythmic echo that carried authority like a shadow following them. Stories about him circulated in hushed tones, tales of sudden rages, public humiliation, and a rare but cutting praise that came only to remind others of their own inadequacy. Some whispered he was brilliant, able to extract perfection from mediocrity. Others called him a tyrant, a man intoxicated by rank and fearful of losing his control over those he ruled. Elena had only glimpsed him once, during a brief paperwork submission. Yet even in that short encounter, she felt the weight of his scrutiny, the kind of look that could strip someone bare, leaving them exposed to judgment and criticism. Her heart had raced, but she had not faltered. That single moment had impressed upon her the subtle danger of her environment. Every action, every word, every expression could be a test or a trap. Over the next few days, Elena observed the colonel more closely, piecing together a picture of the man who governed their lives. He was meticulous in his appearance, a pristine uniform, polished boots, perfectly pressed. Yet behind the precision lay unpredictability. Orders that seemed logical one moment could turn into a sudden storm the next. His mood swings were notorious. Officers who had once thrived under his command found themselves fearful, hesitant, unsure if praise or punishment awaited them. The barracks were alive with whispered warnings. Older soldiers approached Elena with subtle advice, their words heavy with caution. "Stay out of his way," one muttered as she walked past, eyes cast downward. Another offered a glance filled with quiet sympathy. "Don't let him see you as weak, but don't provoke him either." Elena nodded, understanding that survival here required balance, patience, and keen observation. There was no clear path forward, only careful navigation, and she was determined to learn it. Colonel Briggs had a reputation for personal involvement in matters most officers delegated. He scrutinized training, reviewed reports, and inspected even minor administrative details personally. He demanded not just compliance, but excellence, often in ways that seemed unnecessary. His standards so exacting, they created tension among even the most disciplined soldiers. Elena had witnessed him call a soldier to the front during drill and berate him for a fraction of a misstep. The man's face flushed with embarrassment as the surrounding soldiers looked away. That was power, subtle, humiliating, and absolute. Despite the fear he inspired, Briggs had followers soldiers who aligned themselves with his authority, believing that proximity to power would ensure their own advancement. Elena noticed how they flinched when he raised his voice, yet smiled and nodded when he praised them. His charisma, though dangerous, was undeniable. It drew people in even as it repelled them, creating a complex web of respect and fear. Elena realized that navigating this environment required more than courage. It demanded intelligence, awareness, and strategy. Elena began to understand the colonel's patterns. He had favorite routines, predictable triggers, and preferred targets for criticism. She kept meticulous notes in her mind, mentally cataloging behaviors and timing. She observed the way his eyes narrowed when someone questioned him, the subtle way his lips tightened when he detected disobedience. Elena understood that this was a game, a dangerous dance of power, and she had only just begun to learn the steps. The colonel's unpredictability was both a weapon and a trap. Soldiers could never be sure what might provoke his anger, making every day a delicate balancing act. Elena noticed moments where he was unexpectedly kind or approving, moments that seemed like brief rays of sunlight through a storm cloud. But even these were dangerous, because a sudden shift in mood could transform praise into criticism in seconds. She learned quickly to measure her words, to speak only when necessary, and to move with deliberate precision. Still, despite the constant tension, Elena refused to shrink into invisibility. She trained harder than anyone else, not for recognition, but for personal mastery. She arrived early, ran longer drills, and studied regulations with a dedication that earned the subtle acknowledgement of her peers. They began to notice her resilience, her focus, and the quiet strength that allowed her to carry herself with dignity in an environment that often stripped others of theirs. Yet the shadow of the colonel loomed, an invisible wall separating her from the sense of security she longed for. One afternoon, she witnessed a confrontation that left her uneasy. A young soldier, barely out of basic training, had made a minor clerical error. Colonel Briggs, furious, summoned him in front of the unit and unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse. The soldier stood frozen, eyes wide with fear, as the colonel's words cut into him like a whip. Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She understood now the true nature of the colonel's power. It was not just authority, but psychological control. Fear was his currency, humiliation his weapon, and the base was his chessboard. Despite the intensity of the environment, Elena noticed subtle signs of humanity hidden beneath the colonel's imposing exterior. Occasionally, he would pause, consulting quietly with a subordinate, offering instructions in a calm voice that suggested thoughtfulness and intelligence. These moments were rare and fleeting, and they did little to erase the looming shadow of intimidation he cast. Yet, they reminded Elena that the man was not a monster. He was complex, flawed, and dangerous. Understanding him required more than fear. It required observation, patience, and strategy. Elena began planning her interactions with him carefully. She knew direct confrontation could be catastrophic, but she also sensed that passivity would make her a target. The balance was delicate. Assert herself enough to earn respect, but never provoke anger unnecessarily. Each day became a test, each assignment a subtle negotiation of power. Elena was learning the rules of survival on this base, and with each observation, she grew more confident in her ability to navigate the treacherous waters that lay ahead. Nighttime brought a different kind of tension. In the quiet of her quarters, Elena replayed the day in her mind, analyzing every interaction, every glance, every word spoken by or about the colonel. She wrote notes in a small, leather-bound journal, documenting patterns, incidents, and personal reflections. These pages became her private armor, a strategy map for understanding the subtle currents of power at the base. Every detail mattered. Nothing could be dismissed as trivial. Knowledge, she realized, was the only weapon she truly had against someone like Briggs. By the end of her second week, Elena felt the weight of the colonel's shadow more acutely than ever. It was not just his presence that was intimidating, but the awareness that any misstep could unleash his wrath. Yet she refused to cower. Her mind was sharp, her focus unwavering, and her resolve growing stronger with every challenge. She had entered this world as a quiet, determined soldier, but she was beginning to understand that surviving and eventually thriving would require more than quiet determination. It would require courage, strategy, and the willingness to stand when others could not. Even as she navigated this delicate balance, Elena noticed subtle shifts among the other soldiers. Some began to watch her with curiosity, recognizing her composure and intelligence. A few even offered quiet smiles of encouragement, small acknowledgments of her quiet strength. She realized that bravery could be contagious, and that influence did not always require loud action. Sometimes it began with presence, calm focus, and the courage to endure the storm while preparing for the moment when action would become inevitable. Colonel Briggs' shadow loomed over the base like a storm waiting to break. Every soldier felt its weight, and Elena was no exception. Yet, unlike many of her peers, she was beginning to see a path through the darkness. She understood the patterns, studied the behaviors, and prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation that would define her time on the base. The quiet soldier was no longer just observing, she was preparing, strategizing, and waiting for the moment when courage would meet opportunity. The shadow was heavy, but Elena Torres was learning to move within it, not beneath it. She understood that power could be observed, predicted, and countered. She had entered the base hoping to prove herself, and in the process, She was learning the greatest lesson of all. Survival in a world ruled by fear required more than obedience. It required vigilance, intelligence, and a steadfast heart. And she was ready to face the coming storm. It was a quiet morning on the base, deceptively calm, the kind that made soldiers think the day would pass without incident. Elena Torres was at her workstation, reviewing reports and double-checking mission logs, her focus absolute. She had learned to anticipate mistakes, to correct them before anyone else noticed, and to maintain a careful balance that kept her safe while still asserting her competence. Today, however, fate had different plans. Colonel Briggs entered the administrative office without warning. His presence alone made the air feel heavier, the temperature slightly colder, as though the walls themselves braced for his arrival. Elena glanced up, instinctively straightening her posture. Her heart beat faster, not out of fear, but from anticipation. She had learned to read the subtle cues, the way his brow furrowed ever so slightly before anger, the sharp intake of breath before he unleashed his words. Something told her today would be different. It started as a routine review. Elena noticed a minor discrepancy in a report. The colonel had misfiled a mission log, a small clerical error that, if left uncorrected, could have caused confusion in the chain of command. With careful wording, she approached him, presenting the correction politely and professionally. "Sir," she said, "I noticed a small error in this log. I've noted the correct details here for your review." Her voice was calm, steady, measured, the product of weeks of preparation and observation. The colonel's eyes snapped to the paper she held, and for a brief, terrifying second, Elena thought he might dismiss her calmly. But then the change came, the flash of rage, sudden and explosive. His face reddened, his jaw tightened, and a cold, dangerous energy radiated from him like an invisible shockwave. "You dare question my work?" he barked, his voice filling the room and sending nearby officers stiffening in alarm. Elena did not flinch. She had steeled herself for this moment. Before she could take another breath, Briggs advanced. There was a wild, unrestrained movement in his step, one that betrayed years of unchecked authority and sudden anger. Without warning, he shoved Elena forward. The sudden force caused her to stumble, her heart pounding in her chest. Time seemed to slow. She felt a mix of disbelief and terror as the colonel grabbed her by the shoulder and forced her head downward. Cold water splashed against her face as her head was plunged into the toilet, the metallic stench overwhelming, humiliation searing through every nerve. The room fell silent. 2 soldiers had been standing nearby, frozen in place, eyes wide, mouths agape. No one intervened, not because they didn't care, but because fear had rooted them to the floor. Briggs leaned close, his breath hot and harsh, muttering words meant to humiliate, to assert dominance. "This is what happens when you overstep," he hissed. "Do you understand your place?" Elena's ears burned, her vision blurred by cold water and shock. Yet somewhere deep within, a fire began to flicker, a quiet defiance, a realization that humiliation alone would not break her. For a long moment, Elena remained still, her mind racing. The instinct to retreat, to apologize, to beg for mercy, battled against a rising surge of determination. She could feel every heartbeat like a drum of both fear and courage. She thought of her family, of the sacrifices she had made to get here, and of the integrity she refused to surrender. She would not allow this moment to define her, to dictate her future. Something inside her hardened, a resolve forming that she would not merely survive, she would respond. Briggs released her with a shove, and she stumbled back, drenched and shivering, but upright. Her uniform clung to her like a second skin, soaked through, and the smell of disinfectant and humiliation filled her senses. Officers glanced away, some averting their eyes in discomfort, others frozen in indecision, unsure if they should act. Elena wiped the water from her face, her movements deliberate and composed. There was no visible tremor in her hands, no faltering in her stance. To anyone observing, she seemed calm, but inside, a storm raged. She could feel the weight of the colonel's shadow pressing down, his reputation, his authority, and the fear he commanded almost suffocating. But with that weight came clarity. She realized that Briggs' power depended on silence and compliance. Fear was his ally, intimidation his weapon. If no one spoke, if no one resisted, his reign would continue unchecked. And she would not be silent. The incident was not just a personal attack. It was a moment that exposed the base's fragile structure, its dependence on fear to maintain order. Elena's mind raced through options. She could report it immediately, but she understood the potential repercussions. Reports could be dismissed, misinterpreted, or twisted against her. She could confide in others quietly, but trust was fragile, and many were too fearful to intervene. Yet she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Inaction would only allow this abuse to persist. Every other soldier who had suffered, every young recruit silenced by intimidation, depended implicitly or unknowingly on someone finding the courage to speak. That someone could be her. The immediate aftermath was tense. Briggs retreated from the room, his anger barely contained, leaving Elena standing soaked and trembling, but resolute. The two soldiers nearby whispered apologies and reassurances, though their fear was palpable. One offered her a towel, but she waved it away. She did not need comfort. She needed clarity, and she needed a plan. The humiliation was real, raw, and undeniable, but it had sparked something irreversible: determination. She would not allow Briggs to control the narrative or define her identity. That evening, in the quiet of her quarters, Elena began to strategize. She documented the incident in meticulous detail, noting the time, location, witnesses, and precise actions of the colonel. She knew that evidence would be critical. She also began to reflect on his patterns, the subtle clues she had observed, the way his rage flared over minor provocations, and the predictable yet dangerous cycle of his authority. This was not merely about revenge or retribution. It was about justice, about asserting the boundaries that had been so flagrantly violated. Sleep did not come easily. Elena lay awake, replaying the incident repeatedly in her mind, considering every angle. She envisioned the confrontation, the humiliation, and the silent witnesses. Her fear was present, but secondary to a growing resolve. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, it was action in spite of it. She had faced humiliation, and instead of shrinking, had found strength. The incident had been a cruel awakening, a brutal reminder of the dangers she faced, but also a catalyst for her empowerment. By the next morning, Elena's resolve had crystallized. She would act, but she would act strategically. She could not allow emotions alone to guide her response. The colonel's power was formidable, but she had observed its limits, its vulnerabilities, and its reliance on silence. She understood that one careful, documented, courageous act could shift the balance of power. And so, with deliberate composure, she prepared herself for the steps that would follow a path that required courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination. As she stepped out of her quarters, Elena's uniform dry, but her spirit dampened with the memory of yesterday. She held herself taller, moved with precision, and carried a quiet strength that could not be shaken. The colonel's shadow was long and imposing, but it was no longer a threat she could not confront. The incident had revealed not only his brutality, but also her own capacity for resilience. And as she walked across the base, soldiers noticing her poise, a silent truth began to settle in. The quiet soldier was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing to challenge the very system that sought to crush her. The night after the incident was one of the longest Elena Torres had ever endured. The sound of the bass settling into silence seemed louder than usual, every creak and hum echoing in her mind. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, reliving the events that had occurred hours earlier. Her uniform had dried, her hair had been combed, but the humiliation remained, etched into memory like a scar she could not erase. At first, anger boiled inside her, hot and fierce, a wildfire that threatened to consume reason. But as the hours passed, a quieter, steadier flame began to take shape, a fire of resolve that would not be extinguished. Elena thought about what had happened. Colonel Briggs had crossed a line that went far beyond minor mistakes or temper tantrums. He had humiliated her publicly, asserting dominance in a way that violated the trust and respect that were supposed to form the backbone of the military. For a brief moment, she had felt powerless, trapped by his authority and the silence of those around her. Yet even in that dark moment, a seed of clarity had taken root. Power existed only as long as it was unchallenged. She began to consider her options. Reporting the colonel immediately seemed risky. He was powerful, feared, and untouchable in the eyes of many on the base. A complaint could be dismissed or twisted to make her the scapegoat. Yet staying silent felt worse than the incident itself. The memory of the toilet, the sneer on his face, and the frozen witnesses haunted her. She realized that passivity would allow him to continue his reign of intimidation, not just over her, but over every soldier who had suffered in silence. Courage, she decided, was no longer optional. In the solitude of her quarters, Elena pulled out her leather-bound journal, the pages a repository of her thoughts, observations, and reflections from the past 2 weeks. She began writing with deliberate precision, documenting every detail of the colonel's actions, every word, every movement, every subtle intimidation she had observed. This was not just catharsis, it was strategy. She understood that in the coming days, documentation would be her armor, her evidence, and her voice when speaking out became unavoidable. Elena also reflected on her own feelings. Fear had been present, yes, but it had not paralyzed her. Shame had been inflicted, but she refused to carry it as a badge of defeat. She realized that true courage was not about acting in the absence of fear, but about taking action despite it. Each recollection of the colonel's cruelty strengthened her resolve. She would not allow humiliation to define her. Instead, she would transform it into power, using it to fuel the steps she needed to take. The next morning, Elena approached her training and duties with renewed determination. Every movement was deliberate, every task executed with precision. She was no longer simply surviving. She was preparing. Her peers noticed a subtle shift, her posture more confident, her gaze unwavering, a quiet authority emanating from her presence. While the colonel's shadow still loomed, Elena's own fire had begun to shine, small but unmistakable. It was a light that others could see, even if they did not yet understand its full significance. Over the next few days, Elena began to plan carefully. She knew the colonel thrived on fear, but fear could be dismantled with preparation and strategy. She mapped out potential allies, quiet soldiers who had endured Briggs' abuse yet lacked the courage to speak. She considered the documentation she needed: logs, statements, and even minor observations that could establish a pattern of abuse. She realized that a single, well-supported action could ripple across the base, shifting the dynamics of power in ways no rash confrontation could. Yet even as she planned, Elena did not allow anger to cloud judgment. She understood that confrontation without preparation could be catastrophic. A colonel was unpredictable, and one misstep could result in retaliation. Strategy, she reminded herself, required patience. She observed his routines, noting the times he was most irritable, the situations that triggered his temper, and the officers who acted as intermediaries. Each detail became part of her mental map, a way to navigate the treacherous terrain of authority without becoming another casualty. Her reflection also led to a broader understanding. The colonel's power depended not only on his own actions, but on the silence of others. Soldiers had long endured subtle abuse, humiliation, and intimidation, believing it was easier to comply than resist. Elena realized that her response could serve as a catalyst, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered quietly. Courage, she decided, could be contagious. One act of defiance, well executed, could embolden others to speak, creating a ripple effect that might finally hold Briggs accountable. As the days passed, Elena also began to practice resilience in smaller ways. She trained harder than ever, not just physically but mentally. She rehearsed responses to potential confrontations, visualized her actions, and anticipated possible scenarios. Each small victory reinforced her confidence. The fire within her grew brighter with every observation, every preparation, every step taken toward reclaiming agency over her life. She was no longer simply a victim. She was an active participant in her own destiny. The turning point came when Elena realized she needed a clear plan for documentation. She began compiling reports of incidents, cross-referencing timelines, and noting witnesses who could corroborate her experience. Every word, every action, and every detail was meticulously recorded. She understood that this would be the foundation of her argument, the evidence that could not be ignored. Strategy, she knew, was as crucial as courage. She had the fire now, she needed the precision to channel it effectively. Elena also considered the emotional toll. Each moment of reflection reminded her that fear and humiliation were powerful tools of control. She allowed herself to process these feelings, acknowledging them without allowing them to dominate. Writing in her journal became a ritual, a way to convert emotion into clarity. Anger was transformed into strategy, fear into preparation. The incident had ignited a fire, but she tempered it with careful planning. Her resolve was now a blend of heart and mind, strength and intelligence. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in the administrative office, Elena observed the colonel indirectly. He entered briefly, his presence commanding immediate attention, yet unaware that she had carefully monitored his patterns. She noted how officers reacted, how fear influenced behavior, and how subtle gestures communicated dominance. Each observation was a lesson, reinforcing the importance of preparation and awareness. The colonel's power was immense, but not absolute. Every action he took revealed vulnerabilities, moments that could be leveraged strategically. Elena's fire burned brighter with understanding. By the end of the week, Elena felt a shift within herself. The humiliation of the incident had been transformed into determination, fear into calculated readiness. She had established a network of subtle allies, gathered evidence, and internalized lessons about the colonel's behavior. The fire within her was no longer a fleeting spark. It was a controlled blaze, illuminating a path forward. She knew the next steps would require courage, precision, and unwavering resolve, but she was ready. That night, she looked at her reflection in the mirror, wet hair replaced by a neatly tied ponytail, uniform pressed, eyes sharp and clear. The quiet soldier who had entered the base days ago was no longer the same. She had faced humiliation and emerged with purpose. The fire within her would not be extinguished. It was a fire of courage, strategy, and the unyielding desire to confront injustice. Elena Torres had learned that true strength was forged not in moments of comfort, but in the crucible of adversity. As she prepared for the coming days, Elena understood one unshakable truth. The colonel's shadow was vast, but it was not invincible. Courage, intelligence, and preparation could challenge even the most formidable power. The fire within her was now a force to be reckoned with, and she knew that the moment to act would soon arrive. Every decision, every observation, every careful step was building toward the inevitable confrontation that would define not only her future, but the future of everyone under Colonel Briggs' command. The morning air was crisp and quiet, carrying the faint metallic scent of the base that had become so familiar to Elena Torres. She moved with deliberate precision, her uniform flawless, boots polished to a shine, hair tied neatly. But today, it wasn't her appearance that mattered, it was her resolve. She had spent days preparing, observing, and calculating, and now the moment had arrived. The fire within her was no longer quiet. It was a steady blaze, ready to break through the shadow that Colonel Briggs had cast over the base. Elena approached the administrative office, her steps measured but confident. She had chosen her timing carefully, knowing that the colonel would be preoccupied with routine inspections in another wing of the base. She carried a folder containing meticulous documentation, reports of his past abuses, dates, times, and witness statements. Every detail was carefully recorded, creating a web of evidence that could no longer be ignored. This was not a reckless act of defiance. It was the culmination of strategy, preparation, and courage. As she entered the office, several junior officers looked up from their desks, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Elena met their gaze calmly, her posture unwavering. Word had spread subtly through the base that she had endured the colonel's humiliation, and some had begun to watch her closely, curiosity mixed with admiration in their eyes. Today, she would demonstrate that courage could ripple outward, that one act of defiance could embolden others to confront fear. Elena cleared her throat and addressed the officer on duty. "I need to file a formal complaint regarding Colonel Briggs," she said, her voice calm but firm. There was a pause, a moment of disbelief, before the officer gestured toward the paperwork and the protocol she would need to follow. Elena did not hesitate. She began methodically presenting her evidence, ensuring every detail was clearly documented, every witness accounted for, every incident corroborated. She knew that precision and clarity were essential. There could be no room for misinterpretation or dismissal. The act itself was transformative. For years, the colonel's power had depended on silence. Soldiers endured his cruelty quietly, believing that speaking out would only invite further humiliation or retaliation. Elena's decision to step forward, to formally report his abuse, was a spark in a tinderbox of fear. She could feel it as whispers began circulating quietly among her peers, curiosity turning into cautious hope. Others who had suffered silently found themselves inspired by her courage. Their own fear momentarily suspended. In the following days, the ripple effect became increasingly evident. Soldiers who had once avoided one another now exchanged glances, subtle nods, quiet acknowledgments that a line had been crossed, and someone had dared to challenge it. Elena's bravery had created a small but significant shift in the base's atmosphere. Fear was still present, but it was no longer absolute. The colonel's aura of invincibility had been punctured, if only slightly, and that puncture allowed hope to seep through. Colonel Briggs, unaware of the quiet storm brewing around him, continued his routines. Yet even he began to sense a change in the environment. Subtle acts of defiance, small shifts in posture, and the occasional eye contact of soldiers who no longer lowered their gaze all hinted at a disruption in his authority. Elena's action had not gone unnoticed, even if he did not yet know her name. The ripple had begun, and the once unquestioned hierarchy was beginning to tremble. Elena herself remained vigilant. Courage alone was not enough. She understood the necessity of careful observation and continuous preparation. She monitored the colonel's behavior, noting changes in his routine, fluctuations in temperament, and subtle responses to her peers. Every interaction, every glance, every murmured conversation became data, feeding into her mental map of his vulnerabilities. Strategy was now as critical as bravery, and she wielded both with precision. There were moments of doubt, of course. Fear lingered in the background, a shadow that threatened to undermine her resolve. She recalled the humiliation in the restroom, the cold water, the sneer on his face. It was a memory that refused to fade. Yet she no longer allowed it to dominate her thoughts. Instead, she transformed that fear into focus, using it to sharpen her strategy and strengthen her resolve. She was no longer reacting to the colonel, she was anticipating him, preparing for every eventuality. Allies began to emerge in quiet ways. Soldiers who had once endured silent abuse now confided in her, sharing stories and corroborating incidents that added depth and credibility to her complaint. These allies were cautious, still fearful of retaliation, but they had been emboldened by Lana's unwavering stance. Together, they formed a subtle network, a chain of silent witnesses that increased the weight of her evidence and the inevitability of accountability. Courage, she realized, was infectious. Her bravery had created a spark in others who had long believed. Resistance was impossible. As the complaint worked its way up the chain of command, Elena remained composed. She did not gloat or boast. She did not allow the small victories to distract her from the larger goal. Her focus was unwavering, her demeanor calm, her strategy meticulous. Every detail mattered, every witness statement, every log, every timeline reinforced her position. She understood that this was not merely about confronting a single act of abuse. It was about challenging a system that had allowed fear to flourish unchecked. By the end of the week, the base had begun to feel the subtle shift in power. Soldiers who had once flinched in the presence of the colonel now moved with cautious confidence. Conversations began to change. Gestures of support were exchanged quietly, and the air itself seemed lighter. Elena's courage had created momentum, and it was impossible to ignore. She walked across the base with purpose, her head held high, embodying the strength and determination that had become her hallmark. Elena knew the greatest challenge was still ahead. Filing the complaint was the first strike, but it was only the beginning. The colonel's retaliation, if it came, could be swift and severe. She had prepared for this, but vigilance was essential. Every day she balanced caution with courage, observation with action, strategy with resolve. She had ignited a fire within the base, but it had to be maintained carefully until the moment came when the colonel's abuse could be fully exposed, and justice served. At night, in her quarters, Elena reflected on the week's events. She wrote in her journal, documenting every step, every reaction, and every subtle shift in the base's atmosphere. This was not only for accountability. It was also a way to maintain clarity amidst the tension. Writing allowed her to convert fear into focus, uncertainty into strategy. The fire within her burned brighter, tempered by wisdom and careful planning. She had acted, and the first strike had been made. As the days progressed, Elena realized that her actions had consequences beyond her immediate situation. Soldiers began to see that the system could be challenged, that authority was not absolute, and that courage could inspire change. The ripple she had created was expanding, reaching corners of the base previously untouched by hope. The power dynamic was shifting, ever so subtly, and the colonel's once untouchable image was beginning to crack. Elena Torres, the quiet soldier who had once endured humiliation in silence, had taken her first strike. It was deliberate, calculated, and courageous, a move that set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundations of power on the base. She understood that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, that retaliation could come at any moment. But she also knew this. Courage was contagious, strategy was essential, and justice was worth every risk. The first strike had been made. The ripple had begun. And Elena was no longer merely surviving, she was shaping the future, one brave step at a time. The base felt different that week, though no official announcement had been made. The air was tense, but charged with a quiet energy that had been absent for years. Soldiers moved with cautious confidence, subtle nods and fleeting glances exchanged across the mess hall and barracks. Elena Torres had sparked a transformation that even she could not fully measure. Her courage had been contagious, creating small tremors of defiance in a place long ruled by fear. The incident with Colonel Briggs, the formal complaint, the meticulous documentation, the unwavering composure had become a symbol, whispered about in hushed tones by those who had long endured silence. For years, the colonel's authority had seemed unassailable. His presence alone demanded submission. His reputation preceded him like a storm cloud, and soldiers had learned to navigate the base with care, avoiding missteps that might draw his wrath. But now, subtle signs indicated cracks in the armor. Junior officers held their heads slightly higher, carrying out tasks with more initiative. Soldiers in training drills no longer flinched when Briggs passed by. Instead, some maintained steady, confident stances that were rare in recent memory. The fear that had defined the base was being replaced by a quiet determination, a collective realization that Briggs' power was not absolute. Elena observed these shifts with careful attention. She had not intended to lead a movement. Her goal had been personal, justice, but she now understood the broader impact of her actions. Her bravery had illuminated the possibility of change, showing her peers that they could also confront fear without immediate retaliation. Small gestures, a soldier speaking up in a briefing, another correcting a misstep without hesitation, became symbols of awakening. Elena's presence, calm yet assertive, reminded everyone that courage did not need to be loud to be effective. Colonel Briggs, however, remained unaware of the growing undercurrent. To him, the world had continued as usual, his authority unquestioned. He maintained his routines, inspecting drills, reviewing reports, and issuing orders with the same intensity as always. Yet subtle shifts did not escape the keen observation of someone who had already studied him for weeks. Elena noticed it in the quick, uneasy glances exchanged among his subordinates, in the way some officers hesitated before speaking, and in the fleeting uncertainty that flickered across faces when he barked orders. Power, she realized, was fragile, especially when it depended on fear alone. One afternoon, during a routine inspection, Briggs encountered a small but symbolic act of defiance. A group of soldiers, quietly emboldened by Elena's courage, had taken the initiative to correct minor errors in their drill formations without waiting for his approval. The colonel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, but he hesitated. The act was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it revealed a fundamental truth. The soldiers were no longer passive. They were learning quietly to stand within the space of his shadow, testing the limits of his authority. Elena observed from across the yard, a small, controlled smile tugging at her lips. The awakening had begun. By evening, whispers had turned into cautious discussions. Soldiers gathered in corners of the barracks, exchanging stories of past humiliation and sharing observations about the colonel's behavior. Elena had become the unspoken focal point of these conversations, not by choice, but by circumstance. Her courage had inspired others to consider the possibility of accountability, of justice, of standing against abuse. Even those who had long felt powerless began to imagine what it might be like to speak without immediate reprisal. In her quarters, Elena strategized the next phase. Courage alone had initiated the awakening. Now it needed direction. She refined her documentation, cross-referenced witness statements, and identified patterns that could not be ignored by higher authorities. She also worked to subtly guide and protect the emerging network of allies, ensuring that those who had begun to speak had support, guidance, and a shared understanding of strategy. The awakening was fragile. If mishandled, it could falter, leaving the colonel's control unchallenged once more. Colonel Briggs began sensing the change, though he struggled to identify its source. Orders were not followed with the same rigid obedience. Minor mistakes went unpunished or corrected without his intervention, and officers hesitated when called upon. His frustration grew, manifesting in sudden, sharp outbursts at seemingly trivial mistakes. But these eruptions no longer had the same effect. Soldiers had witnessed the formal complaint and the quiet bravery of Elena Torres, and their fear, while still present, was tempered by knowledge that the colonel's authority could be challenged. One evening, during a routine briefing, Briggs' frustration reached a tipping point. He raised his voice, pointing out errors that were minor, expecting immediate submission and apology. Instead, a young officer calmly corrected his own mistake, citing proper procedure with a steady voice. Briggs' face turned red with fury, but the officer maintained composure. Elena, observing discreetly, felt a surge of pride. This was the tangible result of the awakening she had begun. Fear was no longer the only currency on the base. Courage was starting to circulate, subtly but powerfully. Small victories continued to accumulate. Soldiers took initiative, reported errors correctly, and supported one another in ways that had once seemed impossible. Elena's documentation and preparation had become the backbone of a quiet but potent resistance. Every act of courage, no matter how small, weakened the colonel's absolute control. The base, once a landscape dominated by intimidation, now hummed with the tension of change. Soldiers were learning that authority could be challenged with intelligence, strategy, and courage. Nighttime brought reflection. Elena wrote in her journal, noting every subtle shift, every act of defiance, and every change in the colonel's demeanor. She documented the growing solidarity among soldiers, the emergence of quiet alliances, and the first signs that fear was losing its grip. The awakening was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible, observable, and irreversible. Elena understood that the next steps would require precision, courage, and unwavering focus. The colonel's reaction to this change would be pivotal, and she needed to be ready for every eventuality. By the end of the week, the base had transformed subtly but unmistakably. Soldiers moved with steadier confidence. Junior officers spoke with clarity, and whispers of Elena's courage spread beyond the administrative office. Colonel Briggs' control, while still formidable, was visibly challenged. Moments that once would have invoked immediate submission now prompted hesitation and measured response. Elena had catalyzed a shift, demonstrating that courage, strategy, and preparation could destabilize even the most entrenched power. In quiet moments, Elena allowed herself a small measure of pride. She had taken the first strike, witnessed its effects, and now seen the awakening take hold. But she also remained vigilant. The colonel's fury, once triggered, could still be devastating. The balance of power had shifted, yes, but the conflict was far from over. Elena knew that the awakening was only the beginning. The next confrontation would demand every ounce of courage, strategy, and determination she possessed. The base was no longer silent. Soldiers who had long endured fear now saw a path forward, a possibility that justice and accountability could exist within the rigid structure of the military. Elena Torres, once a quiet soldier navigating a world of intimidation, had become the catalyst for change. Her courage had sparked an awakening, her strategy had guided it, and her vigilance ensured it would not falter. The fire she had ignited burned brighter with each passing day, illuminating the path toward a confrontation that could finally dismantle the colonel's tyranny. Elena understood that the awakening was not about revenge. It was about justice, dignity, and the reclamation of agency by those who had long been silenced. Every small act of courage, every subtle defiance, was a building block toward a larger transformation. The base had shifted, the soldiers had begun to reclaim their power, and the colonel's shadow was no longer unchallenged. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and Elena Torres was ready to lead the way. The tension on the base had reached a fever pitch. Elena Torres moved through the grounds with a quiet intensity, each step deliberate, each glance measured. For weeks, she had prepared, observing, documenting, and inspiring subtle acts of courage among her peers. The base had awakened, and now the moment had arrived when the seeds of defiance would bear fruit. The colonel's shadow, once absolute, was beginning to crack, and Elena would be the instrument of that fracture. Colonel Briggs strode across the parade ground that morning, boots striking the concrete with a harsh rhythm, his presence demanding obedience. Yet he sensed something different. Officers hesitated before answering, soldiers exchanged cautious glances, and the usual instantaneous compliance was delayed by mere seconds, but enough to unnerve him. Briggs' eyes darted around, searching for the source of this subtle but undeniable shift. He could not yet identify it, but instinct told him that his power was being challenged. The first confrontation came during a routine inspection. Briggs approached a group of soldiers performing drills, expecting the usual silent obedience. One by one, mistakes were corrected calmly by the soldiers themselves. Small, precise, confident interventions that revealed their growing autonomy. Briggs' face darkened, his jaw clenching. He barked orders sharply, but the soldiers' composure did not waver. This was no longer fear. It was measured defiance, a quiet resistance that cut deeper than his shout or threat. Elena observed from the sidelines, heart steady, knowing that this was only the beginning. Elena's moment came later that afternoon. The colonel summoned her to his office under the guise of routine debriefing. She walked in, posture straight, eyes calm, every movement deliberate. Briggs' expression shifted as he saw her, a mixture of irritation and disbelief crossing his face. "Torres," he said, his voice tight, "I trust you understand your place here." "I understand, sir," Elena replied, her tone calm but unwavering. "And I also understand my duty to the soldiers under this command." Her words were carefully chosen, a subtle challenge framed in the language of responsibility and loyalty. Briggs' eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face, but Elena did not flinch. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, preparing for every possible reaction, and she stood ready. The confrontation escalated quickly. Briggs attempted to intimidate, raising his voice and gesturing aggressively, seeking to reassert control through fear. Yet Elena remained composed. She presented her documentation, laying out the series of abuses, public humiliations, and the patterns of intimidation she had meticulously recorded. She spoke clearly, citing dates, times, and witnesses, exposing the reality that his authority had been maintained not through respect, but through fear. The office was silent, the weight of her words sinking into the room. Briggs' anger flared, his usual tactics failing for the first time. He tried to interrupt, to dismiss her, to reassert dominance through intimidation. But Elena had anticipated this. She remained calm, precise, and resolute, her voice unwavering, even as the colonel's frustration grew. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the realization that his authority was being directly challenged, and that the soldiers on the base were watching, waiting, and learning. The ripple effect was immediate. Word of Elena's confrontation spread quickly, though quietly, through the base. Soldiers who had previously endured humiliation in silence now witnessed the colonel being held accountable, even if only symbolically at first. Whispers of support and cautious encouragement circulated. The psychological power that Briggs had relied upon for years was weakening. The foundation of fear was shifting, subtly but unmistakably. Elena's bravery had exposed the cracks, and the base was beginning to lean toward justice and accountability. Briggs, for the first time, appeared uncertain. His usual confidence, cultivated over years of unchallenged authority, faltered. He realized that intimidation was no longer sufficient. Soldiers were no longer flinching automatically. Their quiet confidence and composure challenged his every action. Elena's careful strategy, her precise documentation, and her unwavering courage had created a moment of vulnerability that the colonel could not easily recover from. In the days that followed, the base continued to change. Soldiers began correcting minor procedural errors without waiting for permission. Junior officers spoke up in meetings, offering suggestions and observations that would have once been suppressed. Small acts of autonomy multiplied, creating a visible shift in the culture of the base. The colonel's authority, though still formidable in structure, had been eroded in practice. Every whispered conversation, every subtle nod, every act of calm defiance reinforced the reality that Briggs' reign of fear was no longer absolute. Elena's leadership became increasingly recognized, though unofficially. Soldiers who had once remained silent now sought her advice, shared their observations, and confirmed incidents. A network of support emerged around her, a quiet coalition of courage and accountability. Together, they reinforced the power of documentation, strategy, and collective defiance. The colonel's shadow, once suffocating, was now challenged not just by one soldier, but by the subtle uprising of the entire base. The turning point came during a scheduled meeting with the base command. Elena was called to present her evidence formally, accompanied by several witnesses who corroborated her reports. Briggs was present, his anger and disbelief evident, yet he could no longer dominate the room through fear alone. Elena's voice was calm, precise, and resolute as she laid out the documented pattern of abuse, public humiliation, and intimidation that had defined his command. Each statement, each piece of evidence, was carefully constructed to reveal the truth without exaggeration. The command officers listened, noting the consistency and credibility of the documentation. They observed the subtle but undeniable change in the base. Soldiers no longer flinched. Juniors spoke with clarity, and a culture of fear had been replaced with measured courage. Briggs' authority, once unquestioned, was now subject to scrutiny, and the consequences of his actions were becoming unavoidable. Elena had orchestrated the fall of a giant, not through confrontation alone, but through preparation, courage, and strategic action. By the end of the day, the colonel's position was shaken. His ability to command unquestioned obedience had been broken, replaced by the understanding that authority without respect was fragile. Soldiers began to speak up more confidently, procedures were followed with integrity, and the culture of fear that had dominated the base for years was being replaced by accountability and vigilance. Elena's courage had catalyzed a transformation, and the foundation of the base's power dynamics had been irreversibly altered. In the quiet of her quarters that night, Elena reflected on the culmination of weeks of preparation, observation, and bravery. The humiliation she had endured, the fear she had faced, and the meticulous strategy she had employed had all led to this moment. Colonel Briggs, once a symbol of unchallenged authority, had been confronted, exposed, and weakened by the very people he sought to control through intimidation. The fire she had nurtured within herself, and among her peers, had become an unstoppable force. Elena understood that the fall of the colonel was more than personal justice. It was a turning point for the entire base. Soldiers who had once endured fear in silence now recognized the power of courage, preparation, and collective accountability. The transformation was subtle but profound. The culture of intimidation had been challenged, and a new standard of respect, integrity, and vigilance was emerging. Elena Torres, once a quiet soldier navigating a dangerous and oppressive environment, had catalyzed a movement that would leave a lasting impact on the base. The fall of a giant, Elena realized, was not about spectacle or vengeance. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed fear to dominate and replacing them with courage, integrity, and the quiet but undeniable power of truth. The base had awakened, the soldiers had reclaimed their agency, and the shadow of intimidation had been replaced by the fire of resilience and empowerment. Elena's journey, from humiliation to courage, had reached its climax, but the legacy of her actions would continue to influence the base for years to come. The morning sun rose over the base with a calm brilliance that belied the turbulence of the past weeks. Soldiers moved with purpose, voices carrying a confidence that had once been absent. The shadow of Colonel Briggs, once so heavy and unchallenged, had receded. Elena Torres walked across the parade ground, her uniform crisp, her posture commanding yet humble. There was a quiet strength in her presence, a fire that had ignited a transformation and now illuminated the path forward for everyone under her command. The formal investigation had concluded, a process that had unfolded over several tense days. Command officers reviewed every document Elena had prepared, reports, witness statements, logs of incidents, and meticulous notes capturing the patterns of intimidation and abuse. The evidence was irrefutable. The colonel's authority had been exercised through fear and humiliation, and the impact on morale and operational efficiency was undeniable. Elena's careful strategy had ensured that justice would be served, not through vengeance, but through accountability. Colonel Briggs had been relieved of certain duties and reassigned, his reputation tarnished, his authority permanently diminished. The soldiers, once constrained by fear, now moved with measured confidence, their obedience guided by respect rather than terror. The base had transformed from a place of silent suffering into a community where accountability and courage coexisted with discipline. Elena's actions had catalyzed this change, proving that even the most entrenched power could be challenged when courage and preparation intersected. Elena's peers greeted her with quiet acknowledgement, subtle gestures of respect, and words of gratitude. Those who had once feared speaking up now sought her advice, sharing observations and seeking guidance on maintaining the integrity of their duties while navigating the remnants of the colonel's influence. She had become a leader, not by rank, but by example. Her courage had inspired others to reclaim their agency, and the culture of fear that had dominated the base for so long was being replaced with resilience and vigilance. In the administrative office, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. She remembered the initial humiliation, the plunge into the toilet, and the raw fear that had accompanied it. At the time, she had felt powerless, trapped, and alone. Yet those moments of suffering had been the catalyst for transformation. From humiliation had emerged strategy, from fear had emerged courage, and from oppression had emerged leadership. Elena understood that the fire within her had been forged in the crucible of adversity, tempered into a force capable of change. Command officers formally recognized her bravery and strategic acumen, though she received no ceremonial accolades. Her reward was far greater, the transformation of the base, the empowerment of her peers, and the knowledge that justice had been served through intelligence, courage, and integrity. The legacy of her actions would persist, influencing the culture of the base, long after the immediate confrontation had ended. Soldiers would remember her not only as a survivor, but as a catalyst for change. Elena also reflected on the subtle power of documentation, observation, and preparation. Her meticulous notes, careful strategy, and unwavering resolve had been as crucial as her courage. She had learned that bravery alone was insufficient in the face of entrenched power. It needed to be guided by precision, patience, and a clear understanding of both human behavior and institutional dynamics. The triumph was not just personal, it was procedural, systematic, and strategic. The transformation extended beyond Elena's personal journey. The base now functioned with a renewed sense of respect and accountability. Soldiers corrected errors proactively, officers engaged in transparent communication, and the culture of intimidation that had once suppressed initiative and morale was replaced by a balanced environment where authority coexisted with integrity. Elena's courage had catalyzed a cultural shift that would endure. The lessons learned were clear. Fear was not an effective tool for leadership, and accountability was not optional, it was essential. In quiet moments, Elena allowed herself to savor the triumph, though she never let complacency take hold. She continued to train, observe, and mentor others, understanding that leadership required constant vigilance. The base had been transformed, but the principles that guided its improvement required nurturing, reinforcement, and the steady presence of those who understood the value of courage, strategy, and integrity. She had sparked a fire now. It was her responsibility to ensure it burned brightly and sustainably. Elena also took time to connect with soldiers individually, listening to their experiences and offering guidance. The ripple effect of her courage continued to expand. Junior officers, once hesitant and fearful, now spoke confidently, offering suggestions and observations that strengthened the base's operational efficiency. Soldiers who had once endured silent suffering now felt empowered to act within the bounds of protocol, understanding that courage and accountability could coexist with discipline and respect. The cultural shift was tangible, observable, and irreversible. One afternoon, as Elena walked past the barracks, she overheard a conversation that warmed her heart. Two soldiers discussed procedures for a mission, referencing lessons learned from her guidance. Their voices carried pride, confidence, and an emerging sense of autonomy. Elena realized that her actions had created not only a moment of change, but a lasting legacy, a culture of empowerment that would endure long after she had moved on from this base. The fire she had ignited was spreading, brightening corners that had once been shrouded in fear. Even Colonel Briggs' reassignment carried lessons. While his authority was curtailed, the base now understood that accountability was unavoidable. The officers and soldiers learned that fear was a brittle foundation for leadership, and that courage, when guided by strategy and preparation, could dismantle even the most entrenched power. Elena's triumph had demonstrated that justice was achievable not through brute force or retaliation, but through intelligence, perseverance, and unwavering resolve. In her quarters, Elena reflected on the full arc of her journey. She remembered the quiet moments of doubt, the fear that had once gripped her heart, and the humiliation that had threatened to define her. She also remembered the decision to transform that pain into strategy, the meticulous documentation, the subtle leadership she had exercised, and the courage she had nurtured. From those experiences had emerged a soldier capable of confronting even the most formidable authority, inspiring others, and effecting systemic change. Elena's journey had been more than personal. It was a blueprint for resilience, courage, and leadership. She understood now that the fire within her was not merely a response to adversity, but a tool for transformation. She had faced humiliation, fear, and oppression, yet emerged not just victorious, but capable of inspiring others to reclaim their agency. The legacy of her actions would endure, shaping the culture, morale, and operational integrity of the base for years to come. As the sun set over the base, casting a warm glow on the parade ground, Elena stood quietly, observing the soldiers moving with purpose and confidence. The shadow of intimidation had lifted, replaced by a culture of accountability, respect, and courage. The transformation was subtle but profound. The triumph was not just hers. It belonged to every soldier who had dared to hope, every officer who had chosen integrity over fear, and every member of the base who now understood that courage could change the course of their lives. Elena Torres, once a quiet soldier humiliated and tested, had become a symbol of resilience and empowerment. Her journey demonstrated that fear could be confronted, that authority could be held accountable, and that courage, guided by strategy and preparation, could ignite transformation. The base had awakened, the soldiers had reclaimed their agency, and the legacy of her actions would echo long into the future. The fire within her, once a spark born of adversity, now burned steadily, a guiding light for others and a testament to the power of courage, integrity, and unwavering resolve. Elena had triumphed, not only over Colonel Briggs, but over the culture of fear he had perpetuated. The base had been transformed, and the legacy of her courage would endure.